Good morning. I'm Susan Hay-Patrick, Chair of the City Club Missoula Board of Directors, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's City Club, where we're going to tackle TIF, tax increment financing. We are recording this meeting. This event will be videotaped by Missoula Community Access Television as part of its media assistance grants to nonprofit organizations. MCAT serves the Missoula area on cable channels 189 and 190. You can also find videos of past City Club forums by clicking the video button on our website, cityclubmissoula.com. City Club's mission is to bring people together to inform and inspire them on issues vital to the community through public forums that encourage the discussion of new ideas and the free exchange of thought. That doesn't talk about our commitment to civility and civil discourse, but I'll cover that in a minute. First, I want to thank the University of Montana and IT guru Alex Karklins for the second consecutive month. UM has loaned us their super duper Zoom format, and Alex has volunteered his time and expertise to help guide us and supervise the back end of this production. Thank you to our sponsors for staying with us. We don't know how much longer we'll be meeting via this Zoom format. It has the advantage of making our forums more accessible and diversifying our audience, but the disadvantage is that we are not putting that diverse audience in the same room to find common ground. But still, sponsorship is important. We appreciate our sponsors and hope others will join in becoming members or sponsors. You can do that and support civil discourse around community issues. Do that via our website, cityclubmissoula.com. I also want to thank our board of directors and our tireless administrator, Eric Legbold. Thank you also to our panelists, whom our moderator will introduce in a minute. And I want to thank that moderator, KPAC's news anchor and assistant news director, Jill Valley, for bringing her talents to the City Club table for the second consecutive month. Before I turn it over to Jill, I want to talk about City Club's commitment to civility and civil discourse and our expectations of all of you today, panelists and audience. I know it can sound outdated and quaint to call for civil discussion and respectful dialogue. I know I sound like Mary Poppins when I talk about standards of behavior. And that can sound especially quaint given what's happening in our country and when hot button issues are being discussed and debated, and when we're so often tempted and even provoked and encouraged to insult and accuse and demonize the opposition. But at City Club, we don't play to the lowest common denominator of behavior toward each other. We try to find common ground with each other. When we're able to meet in person, we do this through table talk, where each table comes up with a question for the panel. We can't do that easily via Zoom, and that's too bad because I think we lose something when we're not required to actively listen to people and find common ground with those with whom we profoundly disagree. And the written question format makes it very tempting to get in snarky comments before our opponents can do the same. In recent months, we've seen how many institutions in our country and our community need to change. And there's plenty of disagreement about what that change should be and how it should happen. And some people think the only way to do this is by provoking, accusing, and demonizing. And I guess you're free to do that. You're just not free to do that here because of City Club's commitment to civil discourse. It's fine to disagree, but if in your comments in the Q&A, you are insulting or profane or threatening, this isn't the forum for you, and we reserve the right to remove you from it. That's not shutting you down. As I said, you're free to engage in that behavior elsewhere. It's just that at City Club, we're committed to a different format and different standards. And frankly, you know, insults and cynicism and sometimes just meanness, that gets in the way of the kind of deep and honest conversations and debates about who we are as a community and a country and who we want to be. And now Mary Poppins is going to sign off and turn it over to Jill. It is my pleasure to introduce KPAX and Missoula's own Jill Valley.
Why, thank you, Susan. This is exciting. It's our second virtual City Club meeting. And if you think about tax increment financing, that may not be the sexiest topic we could come up with, but it's an extremely important topic in Missoula and one that's got a lot of debate lately. And it's often misunderstood. And so we'll have experts here to tell us exactly what it is and how it works. And then we'll hear from a couple of different opinions about how it's implemented in Missoula, what it's done for Missoula, what it should do in Missoula. So it's a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about it and talk about it. Even in the newsroom, we debate about tax increment financing. Should we do a story explaining what it is? Well, this is taking care of that for us, so that's awesome. It's the subject of much debate in our community, not well understood by a lot, so it's important to explain it and debate it. Some say this is an essential mechanism for Missoula to stimulate needed economic development in some of those areas that may not be enticing to those who want to develop and build. Others say it's a giveaway to developers, straining services, and maybe needs to be more transparent. But there's a lot of different opinions on this. So we are going to be talking to three different people. We're going to be hearing from Pippa Browde from the University of Montana. She is going to explain what TIF is, tax increment financing. We're also going to hear from Mayor John Engen and from Adam Hertz. So let me introduce our three folks before we get going and start talking about it. Pippa, there you are. Pippa Browde is a professor. She teaches courses in the federal tax law area. And looking at your resume, pretty much all things tax, from federal income tax to corporate tax. You were a general trial attorney for the IRS Office of Chief Counsel in New York and California. You've written many books about tax issues, and you're currently working on a research project talking about the intersection of federal law, federal tax, and Indian law. So you know your taxes, so you're the perfect person to be talking about that with us. We also have Adam Hertz. Adam was born in Missoula, raised in Polson, went to the University of Montana, graduated in the School of Business, and became the youngest person ever elected to the Missoula City Council, where he served for 4 years. And then in 2016, he got elected to the State House of Representatives, District 96, where he served on the taxation, local government and energy, technology, and federal relations committees. And he's professionally a realtor and real estate developer. So thanks for being here, Adam. And of course, Mayor John Engen, our 50th and longest serving mayor of Missoula. His accomplishments range from planning efforts to make sure that Missoula is sustainable. He restored the city's once private water system to public ownership and has been a champion of conservation efforts, battling hunger and homelessness, and a proponent of thoughtful business development. All of their resumes are very long and wonderful. So if you get a chance, you can get a little more information if you Google them. But let's first start off with Pippa. You're going to explain to us what is tax increment financing and what does it do, and maybe why cities even bother with this. I think you're mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. Thank you very much to the City Club Missoula, my co-panelists, and all the participants today. It is my pleasure to be here. It is not often that I get to talk to so many people about my passion, which are tax policy incentives. And my goal today is to explain tax increment financing, or TIF it's referred to, what it does, what the law in Montana is that enables it to exist, and really how it works. States and local governments, such as counties and cities, use tax increment financing as a tax policy tool to help subsidize costs in redevelopment projects. It works, as Jill mentioned, by allowing the government to borrow against future expected tax revenue to be generated by the redeveloped area. Tax increment financing, to be very clear, is a tax incentive. Tax incentives, sometimes called subsidies, represent deviations from normal tax rules. And our society deems that deviations from normal tax rules are sometimes justified because of the values they serve. Some social or economic behaviors are encouraged or discouraged by the incentives. So the long-standing purpose of tax increment financing, as Jill mentioned, is to stimulate certain types of real estate development by both private and government actors. Tax increment financing is intended to pay for the difference between the higher costs of real estate development projects in urban renewal type settings as opposed to the costs that would exist for new constructions on previously vacant land. So tax increment financing supports policies of urban revitalization, urban infill, while also serving to protect undeveloped land for either agricultural use or just generally for open space. I'm going to do a quick explanation of the Montana state law that allows for local governments to utilize tax increment financing. Then I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about how tax increment financing really works. Every state in the United States, except for one, and I believe it's Arizona, every state except for Arizona utilizes tax increment financing or allows for tax increment financing. It's very common. It's also been around for decades. I'm going to do the most broad overview of how the process is for Montana with recognition that every municipality, every county has different procedures for tax increment financing. I only have 10 minutes. So tax increment financing is not available for all types of development. It's specific in Montana, it's specifically used for two types of development. One is called urban renewal. It's where a geographic area is identified as a location where urban renewal or revitalization could turn, for example, vacant property into usable, livable, or otherwise productive space. The second type of development that qualifies for TIF in Montana is what's referred to as a Targeted Economic Development District, or you may have seen it, TEDD. The TEDD, those Targeted Economic Development Districts, are designated with the goal to increase what's under the statute referred to as, quote, value-added economic development within a geographic area. The process very generally is as follows. The local government designates the district for either urban renewal or targeted economic development. And in that process of designation, it has to give notice to the public about its intent. And there has to be many opportunities for the public to meet and comment on the proposed district. Once the public hearing or hearings are held and notice and comment periods are given, the local government can approve the district. Once approved as a district, developers can apply for TIF funds and they can use them for the following types of expenditures. This list is not exhaustive. Land acquisition, demolition costs, costs for infrastructure such as improvements to sewer or water lines, sidewalks, bicycle racks. Those are some of the examples. Construction costs if the buildings are owned by a governmental entity, and quite controversially, relocation of occupants. In sum, tax increment financing is authorized under state law. Their process requires identifying the tax increment financing purpose, such as urban renewal or economic development, creating the plan, providing for public notice and comments, and then financing the TIF. So now let's get to the real tax piece. And that is how tax increment financing works. There are three component parts to tax increment financing. First, there's the tax. Second, there's an increment. And third, you guessed it, there's a financing component. I'll address each in turn and use some graphics to illustrate my point. The first component of tax increment financing has to do with the tax being utilized. By far the most common, and Montana is no exception, is for tax increment financing to be generated from ad valorem real property taxes. Ad valorem is Latin for according to value. It just means that real estate property taxes are based on property values. The shorthand in our lexicon for ad valorem real property tax is often just property tax. That the specific tax used to fund these incentives is the tax imposed on real property, such as land or buildings, as opposed to personal property, such as cars and boats. Municipalities and counties use real property taxes to fund TIF because real property taxes are the biggest generators for revenue among the smaller branches of state government. Here in Missoula, we don't pay city income taxes, but we do pay Montana Montana state income taxes. So back to the real property taxes, there's a specific method for valuing property for purposes of taxes through tax appraisals. That process works to arrive at what's called an assessed value of property. There's also a mill levy process that occurs for local governments. Because local governments are usually required to operate within balanced budgets, the local government will determine their budget ahead of time, and then their projected revenue sources, including property tax revenues. And from that point, the mill levy is set, and property tax allocations are based on appraised values. Those are made to determine the mills to be levied. Basically, the required total property tax revenues are divided by the total assessed values within the jurisdiction. And it's really a way to allocate the relative contributions to the cost of government. The appraisal process and the mill levy process are admittedly quite complex. But the key takeaways here are to understand that local governments, including here Montana, rely on property tax revenue to fund government. And individual property owners are the primary contributors to the cost of those local governments. Another important takeaway is to understand that a simple formula determines the amount of tax revenue. And I will show you, I'm going to share my screen. Tax revenue is a function of the rate of tax imposed multiplied or times the property tax base. So I'm not here to talk about the tax rate being imposed, although you can understand just from looking at this formula that if the amount of the property tax base goes down, the rate of tax would have to go up in order to keep the revenue stream constant. So the base here is the property tax base. And this becomes important in just a second when I'll talk about the increment. So that's the tax component of tax increment financing, and now I'll explain the increment. Tax increment financing, the increment works by severing the assessed value of property at the date that the tax increment financing district is created. And this is sometimes called the baseline tax revenue. So when that is severed from the expected future increases to the assessed value, the increment goes to a TIF fund and the baseline value goes to the general fund. So another way to say that is that the TIF works by redirecting property tax revenue increases that are generated from the property that is developed within the TIF boundaries. Those increases are allocated into a separate fund, the TIF fund, and they pay for TIF activities that I mentioned earlier, whereas the baseline revenues go to the general fund to pay for schools, roads, and other infrastructure and governmental costs. To really grasp the concept of the increment, take a look at these slides. First, I've got a picture of a graph showing the expected property values increasing over time. There's an assumption that over time property values will increase. That's why the arrow is pointing up. Now, the second picture shows you the date that the tax increment financing district is created. Okay, this highlights the baseline property value. And it's reasonable to assume that prior to redevelopment on the project, the value of the property is lower, right? It's lower because no development has yet occurred. Okay? This is the start of identifying the increment. Essentially, this property value will be frozen as the frozen value for the revenue that flows to the general fund. Now, my third picture shows the life of the TIF, which in Montana is typically 15 years. The baseline revenues here in the blue rectangle, all of those baseline revenues that are frozen from the initial value at the date of the TIF, those go to the general fund to pay for schools and roads and other costs. The triangle, all the revenue, this is referred to as the increment, all the tax revenues in this increment go to fund the TIF. Okay, this represents the increase in value over the base that was set at the beginning of the TIF. The third piece to show you here that's not highlighted is what happens after the TIF ends. And after that point, these increased property values that generate hopefully increased tax revenues, all of these monies will go to the general fund, back to the general fund. So that's the increment portion of the revenue attributable to the increase in property tax values from within the TIF boundaries that get segregated out. The third component I mentioned is the financing component. And very briefly, I'd like to say that as revenue is generated by the TIF, you can see it's going to be generated increasingly over time as the property values increase over time. At the date that the TIF is created, the government may not have the cash on hand to pay the costs that are specified in the TIF plan. To enable the government to do so, the government will enter into various lending arrangements, usually obtaining bond financing. The bond process is quite involved. It requires revenue study, underwriters who issue the bonds, and these are normally long-term bonds, at least 15-year period, as the TIF period is in Montana. And then what happens over time is that this increment will be used to pay off the principal and interest on those revenue bonds. So right there is the basics, the 10-minute basics on TIF, how it works under Montana state law, knowing that there are specific rules under every local jurisdiction, and then how TIF works as a tax incentive by siphoning or by pulling off this excess revenue generated within the TIF district and putting that to pay for the tax increment financing, while the baseline, the frozen baseline, goes into the general fund. That's all I got.
Sorry there, I muted myself. Wow, that was amazing. Thank you for the charts and graphs. I think that really kind of helps illustrate what it is we're talking about. All right, so Mayor Engen, your chance to speak for 10 minutes or so and talk to us about, your thoughts on TIF.
Well, thank you, Jill, and Pippa and Adam, and all of you for participating today. Appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about this program, which has been in place since the 1970s in Missoula. So TIF is nothing new to Missoula, and the original TIF district, some folks may recall, was downtown Missoula. There's a long and storied history of changes in downtown Missoula as a function of the opening of Southgate Mall, and that first urban renewal district tipped up, as Pippa suggested, under statute, using a definition of blight. So TIF writ large and urban renewal writ large is really a question of subsidy. Do we as policymakers and folks responsible for the allocation of municipal resources believe that certain projects deserve subsidy? We subsidize lots in this country at the federal, state, and local levels, but there aren't many opportunities for subsidy or incentive in Montana for local jurisdictions, and TIF really ends up being one of the I think most powerful and frankly only tools to provide incentives for business development and real estate investment. I think a couple of important things to note. One is that under our rules and under statute, there are very specific uses for tax increment, and Pippa described those, I think, in great detail. In the case of Missoula, the way tax increment has been deployed over the years has largely been about public infrastructure that's associated with other projects, or taking the increment that is a function of those projects within urban renewal districts and applying it to public infrastructure. And I have a laundry list in front of me of projects that Tiff has funded over the years, and some may come as a surprise to folks. So in terms of public infrastructure, Tiff has built 15 miles of sidewalks, 10 miles of streets, 9 bridges, either over the Clark Fork River railroad tracks, streets, or irrigation ditches, 8.4 miles of trails, 94 acres of parks improvements, parking structures, which are important to Missoulians. Central Park, Bank Street, Park Place, and the Rome structure would not exist but for investment through the Missoula Redevelopment Agency and TIF. Various water and sewer extensions and alley paving, particularly in downtown Missoula. Projects that have tremendous community value all have TIF investment. Karis Park, Brennan's Wave, the Milwaukee Trail, Bitterroot Trail, Ron's River Trail, the gazebo at the Missoula County Courthouse, a carousel for Missoula, Dragon Hollow, the Aquatic Center at Currents, the Missoula Art Museum, Mobash Skate Park, McCormick Park, Silver Park, MRA Park, MRL Park, the Civic Stadium at Oberon Park, the Montana Natural History Center. We've done historic preservation investment throughout downtown, public art throughout downtown, the underbridge at Madison Street, the Missoula Children's Theater, neighborhood community gardens, the Senior Citizens Center, and street trees throughout the community. We also invest heavily, and this again is about subsidy. It's about making choices as public entities as to where we invest our resources to make lives better. So permanently affordable housing is a critical issue in Missoula, has been for a long time and continues to be. TIF was instrumental in the construction of Clark Fork Commons, permanently affordable, as was the Equinox and Solstice Apartments, the Sweetgrass Commons, Lee Gordon Place, the Palace Apartments, the Garden District Housing Project on Catlin Street through the Housing Authority, and Fireweed Court. And in addition, we help those nonprofits that are serving our most vulnerable in the community, including Partnership Health Center, Salvation Army, Western Montana Mental Health Center, several of those projects, the Poverello Center, Garden City Harvest, the YWCA, Missoula Food Bank, and City Life Community Center. So those are clear examples of where TIF is invested and where TIF revenues are used. We also use them to support local business or national business in some cases where but for TIF dollars, a project would either not happen or be at a smaller scale. Among the poster children for that, and among the controversial projects of late, the Marriott Hotel, the old Missoula Mercantile site. We believe that project, but for TIF, likely would have happened at a smaller scale, or if at all. And remember that the investment there was in infrastructure around the hotel, not the bricks and mortar that built the hotel. What happens when we make that community investment, when we make that choice about subsidy, is that we take a tax base and grow it. I believe that TIF is an investment in the future, and as Pippa described, that growth in tax revenue through increment. That increment at the end of the life of a TIF district goes back to the tax base. So if we look back at that first urban renewal district in downtown Missoula, you'll find that roughly $20 million were invested in that district through TIF that leveraged what we believe was about $200 million in additional investment. And when that district expired, all of that additional tax revenue, that value, as it were, went back to the general fund, both for not only for the city, but other taxing jurisdictions, including the schools, county, and state. We believe that in every case, that investment in improving values in the community is a long-term, provides a long-term return for the community, in addition to improving things immediately. TIF is a tool that I rely on when I talk to businesses, both local and folks interested in relocating here. as an opportunity to either buy down the cost of land or provide more or better community public infrastructure as associated with those projects. It's a tool that many sophisticated developers understand, and it's a tool that local businesses have used for years to improve their buildings and their properties in an effort to better serve the public. I can go on and on, but I won't. I'll let Mr. Hertz say his piece, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you, Marin. Go ahead, Adam. You have the floor now. Talk about your thoughts on TIF.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, and thanks for Pippa for the great explanation. And it's great to be back debating the mayor. It's been a 5-year hiatus, but the band is back together, and really appreciate the opportunity. You know, I certainly don't disagree with some of the points that Mayor Engen made about appropriate use of TIF. And I think, you know, when it comes down to TIF, I'm not seeking the pure abolition of TIF by any means. I'm seeking a pro-reform stance. I'm seeking the elimination of what I see as TIF abuse, you know, skirting state law or finding loopholes in state law, and not efficiently using TIF. I think it's important just to clarify one thing, that when we talk about increment in TIF districts, we're not just talking about increment for new projects. It also includes just increases in value. So, you know, if your home was worth $200,000 when the TIF district was created, and it's worth $300,000 now, that additional increment also goes into the TIF district. And I'll get back to that in a little bit, but there's been some reforms at the state legislature that I think were important on that point. Given the existence of inflation, though, I think the base is not enough to fund local government. And so the problem that exists with TIF districts is that local government, whether it's the county or the city or schools, can't provide the services they need to provide without increasing taxes, because inflation exists, yet the district, the base is capped, and that's all they have to pull from. So it does require them to find revenue elsewhere. Certainly, you know, the big argument there is the but-for argument. As the mayor mentioned, he believes that many of these projects would not happen but for the existence of TIF. I like to call that the capture versus creation argument, which is to say that, you know, it's certainly possible that some of these projects may not exist but for subsidy. But if we look at, you know, projects such as the Southgate Mall remodel and expansion, Southgate Mall had announced their intent to do a very large project. They had been excluded from Urban Renewal District 3 when it was first created because there were no findings of blight at the mall. When they began to announce their project, the Missoula Redevelopment Agency, I think, saw an opportunity to capture some of that new increment that otherwise, you know, would have just gone to the taxing jurisdictions as it normally should, and, you know, stepped in to try and be part of the project, capture that new increment, and, you know, build a wish list of things that the city wanted to build. That project may not have existed at the scale that it exists at today, but for TIF, but it certainly would have existed. So I think it's a very poor argument to make to say that, you know, any or most or all of the increment that exists in these districts is because of the existence of the district. I think that's one of the hardest things to really sort out is, you know, every developer, I'm a real estate developer myself, every developer is going to, of course, approach the MRA or the city and say, you know, we can't make this project work without subsidy. And sometimes that might be true and sometimes it might not be. In many cases, I believe that subsidy is simply padding profit and not necessary in order to make the project come to fruition. That's a difficult thing to prove without transparency in the financials of these projects. And I don't know how much transparency the MRA is getting from these developers. I certainly know that the public doesn't get much. And I understand that because, you know, many development models, you know, benefit from being somewhat secretive because of, you know, investors or developers who have their own business models that they don't necessarily want to share. I think, downtown Missoula is probably one of the best examples of the use of TIF, and the city regularly, when speaking from the pro-TIF standpoint, regularly goes back to downtown Missoula as it was dilapidating due to the creation of Southgate Mall, which ironically years later then got its own TIF assistance. There's been other uses, as the mayor mentioned, that I think have been valuable to the public and necessary to eliminate blight. The important thing to note is that helping nonprofits, growing the tax base, creating jobs, creating economic development, those are all great things. None of them are mentioned in state law as it exists today when it comes to urban renewal districts. The goal is simply the elimination of blight. And in my view, certainly that definition could use a lot of work at the state level, but in my view, I think it's pretty hard to make an argument that there's very much blight that exists in the city of Missoula. When we talk about blight, I think the purpose of urban renewal districts was to clean up zero growth and truly blighted areas that nobody would invest in, areas that have essentially worthless or nearly worthless property values, and the need for demolition or environmental remediation that just simply could not exist but for TIF. The problem is that instead, in a market like Missoula where there's limited inventory and there's a lot of demand, is that no developer doesn't understand the existence of TIF. So what it does is it just drives up property values because developers know that they're going to get assistance. And so if the tool did not exist, I think in many cases property values would simply be lower in these areas because the developer would have to account for things like lack of infrastructure or necessary demolition. If you look at other cities, like say Butte, for instance, there's certainly properties that are worthless, that the city might give to a developer and need TIF in order to get development there. I simply don't believe that's the case in Missoula, although it has been at points in the past. Going back to the capture versus creation, there's other examples throughout the city of that. I love Stockman Bank. I bank with Stockman Bank, but I certainly will note that I don't think Stockman Bank had any intention to be anywhere but downtown Missoula and in central Missoula, because that's what it takes to be a big player in the banking market in the city of Missoula. And when they came to the market, they got TIF assistance for both buildings. Now, I don't blame them for doing that because it's a tool that exists and it's a handout, that certainly any developer would take. The problem is, I don't believe TIF was necessary to make those projects happen. And so what you have is a big subsidy that takes money out of the pockets of the local school district, the county, the city general fund, in order to subsidize development that otherwise would have existed anyway. They had the money for it to happen. Those were the locations they wanted that development to happen in. They simply got, what I would amount to a corporate welfare handout. There's other issues, with pet projects that end up happening and not necessarily, good use of funds. It was mentioned that the creation of the timeline of a TIF district is 15 years. But if the city borrows money within a TIF district, they can extend that by up to another 25 years if that's the life of the bond. So in Urban Renewal District 3, which is generally central Missoula, when I was on city council, the district was approaching the end of its life. And in order to extend that district, the city borrowed nearly $5 million in order to build the South Avenue pedestrian bridge. I understand that that's a project that's worthwhile. If that was an at-grade crossing, Reserve Street would be even more of a disaster than it already is. It was about a $5 million project. If you include interest, it goes up to $7+ million. We could have built an underground crossing at about $1.25 million. Underground crossing is used on Russell and seems to work just great. But what happened now is that district's 40 years long. It's long enough for it to become blighted again. I mean, in 40 years' time, you could have new development that then, is no longer useful or is dilapidated by the end of that. And so you have to start all over again. So I think one of the big things is really the length of these districts is simply too long. One of the legislative reforms that I would propose is that that district length stays at 15 years. Any bonding that exists within the project further out than that can continue to collect increment to pay on the bonds, but additional grants or debt should not be taken out during that time period, so that these are more limited, that they're focused on fixing a blight issue and then getting the money back to where it belongs. Because when we talk about the sunset and there being a windfall to other taxing jurisdictions, it just hasn't really been the case because these districts have lasted so long. There were some issues that were fixed in the 2017 legislative session. One issue was that voter-approved bonds and the funds from those were going into TIF districts if the property was in a TIF district. So you might have lived in Urban Renewal District 3 in Central Missoula. You voted for the school bond, and you were willing to raise your own taxes to fund new buildings at the school. And unfortunately, that didn't happen because you were paying extra as if you were paying into those bonds, but instead those funds were getting diverted to the Missoula Redevelopment Agency for TIF. I think that's entirely wrong, and luckily the 2017 legislature fixed that, not looking back, only moving forward. So that money, if you live in one of those TIF districts, is still going towards the TIF district rather than the school bond where it should be going. And I would note that the League of Cities and Towns and the city of Missoula adamantly opposed that kind of a reform. I mean, I think that kind of a reform is just a no-brainer. It's just a matter of fairness. There's another issue that we ran into with remittance of excess Tif. In 2018, you may remember that the city of Missoula was facing a budget shortfall and sought to tap into the Tif districts in order to make the budget whole. Previous to the 2017 legislative session, the city could have chosen to remit the excess Tif back to its own budget just to fill its own budget gap, but would not have to include the state and the county and school district in that remittance. And in 2017, we passed a bill that said if you remit excess Tif, it needs to be remitted back to the taxing jurisdictions in the way that it normally would be collected by those districts. And I think that was a great reform because what had happened in a city like Whitefish was that they had almost 30% of their tax base tied up in Tif increment. And the city was kind of colluding with the school to make sure that the schools got their money, but we're cutting out the county and the state. And so as a matter of fairness, it's important that when that money is remitted, that it goes to the taxing jurisdictions as it should. And I think that brings up probably one of the most important legislative reforms that I think is important is capping the city's total tax base that can be tied up in increment. So as I mentioned, Whitefish had almost 30% of their tax base tied up in increment, which really is unfair to the state, it's unfair to the county, it's unfair to the school districts. I don't know what that cap needs to be. I don't know whether it's 5% or 10%, but I think you have to decide how much of your local tax revenue can be tied up in TIF versus where it should go. Otherwise, what you end up with is other taxing jurisdictions that are starved for cash and have to raise taxes, or in some cases might not even be able to raise taxes. And so I think that's an important legislative change. I think it also forces good decisions, because if funds are limited, efficiencies are sought. When funds are unlimited, efficiencies typically are not sought.
Hey, Adam?
Yes.
We're getting lots of questions in from people. Would you mind if we, can you have one more thought, finish it up, and then we'll move on to that?
Absolutely, I appreciate that. And I think the final legislative change is that we need to redefine blight, or we need to rewrite the TIF laws to, find a new purpose. If it's not blight elimination, if it's actually just, public infrastructure, or if it's job creation, or if it's economic development, then I think we need to be honest about that.
Awesome. Thank you very much for your well thought out points on that. Susan, did you want to talk about the question process, or I've got them? Should I just go ahead and start asking? You're on mute right now, by the way. There you go.
Thank you both very much, or all three of you very much. Yes, now we go to Q&A, a very rich part of every City Club discussion. A reminder to please use the Q&A, not chat, to type in your questions. Two of our board members will forward them to Jill to pose to our panel. It's unlikely, unfortunately, that all questions will be answered due to time limitations. And please know that we are looking for questions, not position statements. but succinct civil questions. And members of the media, please wait to ask your questions after the forum. We're happy to connect you with our panelists. So back to you, Jill.
Okay, our first question comes from Edward Brown, and I think I'll direct this to the mayor, and then we'll go to Adam after that, and then Pippa, if you hear something and you want to jump in, that'd be awesome. All right, Edward asks, what happens if a TIF gives money to a developer and then the developer goes bankrupt or is unable to perform?
So typically, the application that a developer will make is for public infrastructure. So that infrastructure will exist whether the developer operates or not. We build sidewalks, we connect sewers, we do water infrastructure. In some cases, we do street infrastructure. So those improvements exist whether a developer performs or not. And one of the things I like about TIF is it's a significant change from economic development in Montana that happened previous. So, for example, in Butte, the Butte Silverboat used property tax abatement fairly regularly as an incentive. They would invite factories, for example, to locate in Butte. They would abate property taxes. That is, business would not have to pay property taxes for some period of time. They would get another offer from another state. They would pull up stakes and leave, and there was no clawback provision. The investment we make remains part of the base and actually improves community infrastructure.
There we go. Adam, do you want me to repeat the question?
No, I think I have it. So,
okay.
Thank you. So, the city council has oversight over bonding requests and if the MRA wishes to purchase land because the MRA can't own land. So generally, just one point we kind of missed here was that there's an unelected, appointed board that oversees these spending decisions in Missoula. And I think that's, an issue that also needs to be addressed. But getting back to the question, generally when city council is asked to approve bonding requests, I don't think there's a lot of thought about, are these risky projects? Because in the past, generally in Missoula, they haven't been. I think we're actually approaching a period of time where we need to be a lot more careful about what happens in those cases. Washington Prime Group, who's the new owner of Southgate Mall, faces the very real risk of going bankrupt right now. They actually had their debt rating lowered to CAA3 by Moody's recently, which means they're in very poor financial condition and subject to very high credit risk. So what happens if Washington Prime is not paying their property taxes and nobody wants to buy their property tax lien? I don't think that's probably going to happen. I think there's probably a new buyer who would take over. But there's certainly some risk there. And even, more risky example is that, as Pippa mentioned, bonds are typically sold up front in the larger projects to finance future tax revenues. And so a really big project that had been talked about recently was the Riverfront Triangle project. And we were expecting construction this summer, which isn't happening, obviously, due to the COVID-19 crisis. But what would have happened had the city council approved selling those bonds? And in that short period of time between selling those bonds and COVID-19 happening, the developer decided that they no longer wanted to move forward with the project or had to put it on pause. We could have $10+ million in debt with really no assurance of when that project was going to happen. And no revenue to back those bonds. Frankly, I think the timing probably, was a matter of weeks or maybe a month that really saved us from having that kind of risk exposure.
So I would argue that the underwriting around those bonds provides tremendous security for the city of Missoula, both financially in terms of property over time.
Kind of a follow-up question from Dave Lapham is asking, is there a safeguard in place for tip dollars given to businesses who use the money and then sell shortly after the project is done? And his example there is Southgate Mall.
Well, again, the redevelopment agency doesn't have money in bricks and mortar at Southgate Mall or the businesses that are there, but for some facade improvements on what was the Lucky's Market. The lion's share of that project was building the road connecting Brooks and Reserve, which we believe will serve a tremendous long-term purpose for the city of Missoula, for that property, and for residents as well. We think that that infrastructure adds value and will add value over time and increase the tax base.
Do you want to comment on that, Adam? Or?
Yeah, I would agree that when TIF is used to build infrastructure, certainly I don't see any necessity for kind of a recapture because, it's infrastructure meant to benefit the public. Missoula did have a facade improvement program. I'm not sure if that continues to exist, but there were facades at, Arby's, a number of fast food restaurants and different businesses across Brook Street, where those improvements were entirely given to the business. There was really no public benefit other than, I guess, if you like Arby's to look better when you drive by it. But I think, in those cases, it's a fair point. Frankly, I don't think those kinds of projects should qualify for TIF. But if they are, I think some kind of recapture provision certainly makes sense.
And we're happy to do that. I think it's important to note with the facade program that the redevelopment agency board says no. The redevelopment agency staff and board have said no on more than one occasion, and in at least one occasion, that is the hip strip. We had folks who very much wanted us to tip up an urban renewal district along the hip strip, and our study could not demonstrate blight, even in its broadest definition. So a TIF district doesn't exist there.
So here's a question for Adam. If Missoula didn't use TIF, is there any other effective or promising tool that we could benefit from as we develop the community? Because are there
As I mentioned, I'm not seeking the elimination of TIF. I'm seeking more efficiency and reform in TIF. So are there other tools that could be used? Better budget prioritization. I mean, I think public infrastructure, police and fire are certainly important pieces of the local government budget. And I think, you have to prioritize that budget in order to focus on those. In cases where you're outside of the TIF district, there is, new development and new infrastructure happening, and that's paid for by private developers. And that brings up, another issue about fairness is, you've got Albertsons on Brooks. That Tremper Shopping Center received a lot of TIF assistance. I'm not sure if Albertsons got facade improvements or if it was generally surrounding infrastructure. But you've got a big subsidy there to a multi-billion-dollar company, and then probably a half a mile away you've got Rosars, which has some local or regional ownership that doesn't get any assistance, and so it creates this unfair competition. And I'd be hard pressed to believe that the Trempers area is blighted as compared to where Rosars is.
Another question, people are curious, what does urban renewal look like in a post-COVID world? Are we shutting stuff down, or how do we move forward in the midst of this?
Well, that's a great and interesting question, and to a certain degree, by virtue of the fact that we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know. I continue to be bullish on Missoula for lots of reasons. Not the least of which is I think folks still want to live here, folks still want to do business here and make investment here. And I still think that the Drift project at the Riverfront Triangle has tremendous potential and is a great opportunity for the community on lots of levels. I think it's also important to remember that if we're looking at Tremper Shopping Center, for example, that's a local company with a long history in Missoula that applied for TIF assistance so that it could attract those out-of-state dollars in the form of lessees like Albertsons and others. The rents come to local businesses who employ local people and redeploy that money within the local economy. So I think it's important to make that distinction. I think the future of Missoula is bright. COVID is a pause, and it's a challenging pause. We've got a lot of challenges here locally in the state and around the country on all fronts, but I think our ability to guide investment through TIF is important. One of the other things to note about TIF is that in many cases, the fact that there is TIF money involved in projects means we have a say in what those projects look like. I'll go back to the Mercantile, for example. That project on its own, without TIF assistance, required nothing more than a building permit. That building could have been torn down in a matter of days, none of those materials recycled or reclaimed. The pharmacy, which the community said it wanted preserved, was preserved in no small part because we had a say in it through TIF investment. We have a say in design, and in the case of housing projects, we have a say in affordability, and that's critical at this point.
Do you have any thoughts on that one, Adam?
Yeah,
I have another question, so go ahead.
yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, you know, the COVID shutdown is going to ripple across economies across the nation. I think Missoula is well positioned to make it through. As I mentioned, I mean, I think there's certainly some real risk of Washington Prime Group going bankrupt. I don't think that's the end of the mall. I think it's just perhaps either a restructuring or the end of their ownership, and new ownership would take over. The commercial real estate market, you know, across the nation is certainly going to see more vacancy, as I think, you know, some office uses understand that they can work from home without having to incur the expensive overhead of leasing. And I think there's probably going to be restaurants and other retail businesses that do go out of business and leave some vacancy. But I think Missoula's fairly well positioned. I would just note on the Albertsons location in the Tremper Shopping Center that Albertsons did exist in that location before that TIF assistance came. You know, I think they would have existed whether it came or not. If they didn't, it certainly would have opened the opportunity for another business to exist there, which might have been a locally owned grocery store or regionally owned grocery store.
This is a question from Greg Tollefson, perhaps asked of Pippa or the mayor. What percentage of Missoula's tax base is tied up in TIF at this point?
So as of our last fiscal year, it was roughly 14%. Historically, that is probably pre-2017 or so, hovered around 4 or 5%.
Sound good to you, Pippa? Yeah, probably. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics on those details.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. Here's another question. Mayor Engen, do you have a general estimate of how much of the increment in a district is used to cover private development costs, such as demolition, land acquisition, or relocation, versus how much is used for upgrading public infrastructure in the district and or beyond the property that is being developed?
So off the top of my head, no. But I can tell you in the case of land acquisition, the public benefit is almost always public infrastructure or permanent affordability. So for example, we purchased at a discount what was the Roscoe Steel site, basically the triangle between South Avenue, Johnson Street, and North along the railroad tracks. We purchased that from Montana Rail Link at a discount. We built a public park there, Montana Rail Link Park, leveraged some resources from private donations through Montana Rail Link, and we'll tipped up that park, and we'll redevelop the remainder, most likely for affordable housing and mixed use as a function of public process. So whenever we're making that direct subsidy, there's always what I consider a clear and overwhelming public benefit that justifies that investment.
Okay. Here's another question from a All right, where did it go? May Hassman asking everyone, where were the taxes coming from for projects like trails and bridges and currents before TIF, and who pays the taxes after the TIF sunsets?
So I think we tend to think of our community interests in zero-sum terms, and the fact of the matter is that parks and trails are community values, and I believe that citizens would demand that we pay for them in one way or another. TIF allows us, I think, to do that in the cases where those projects can happen within urban renewal districts in a relatively painless way without going to a general obligation bond or without raising general fund taxes or parks taxes or road district taxes. I think we would have fewer of those projects completed, or we would have a larger general fund or parks fund budget, but for the fact that we've been able to make that TIF investment while those districts exist.
Question for Adam. We talked about the people who make the decisions on where the TIF funding goes. Should those people be elected? Because I don't believe they are now. You kind of alluded to the ones picking the projects. How do you think that should work? And is it a transparency issue, or how would you move forward if you were in charge of this?
I think there's a couple of options. So I think a fairly easy option is just to make it be the governing body, make it be the city council. That's how it is in some cities. The city has the prerogative right now to choose. In Missoula's case, the mayor appoints those members, city council approves the appointments. In the case of Billings, they actually essentially sub the work out to a private contractor, which I think really lacks transparency. I think an ideal scenario might actually be where there's ownership from all taxing jurisdictions that can be affected by a potential loss of revenue, which is that the board could be made up by a couple of elected officials from the city, somebody from the county who's elected, and maybe somebody who represents the state and somebody who represents the local school district. So that way, it really kind of forces an efficient and thoughtful use and has direct accountability to voters.
Got a couple of good questions, and I'm going to stick with Adam for a second because you're a real estate developer. How do you see TIF helping to create more affordable housing that isn't already subsidized?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly examples. I think, one of the bigger challenges with affordability is simply just density. So, I think infrastructure investment can help spur higher density development. There's certainly cases, probably not in Missoula as it pertains to affordable housing, but where parking structures can help benefit and spur more high density growth. There was a case in the North Reserve Scott Street Urban Renewal District where there was a townhouse project that used TIF funds to build, not subsidized, but market rate housing that was, workforce housing. I'm not sure that project really needed TIF assistance in order to happen, but it did get it. So I think it can certainly play a role in housing affordability. But the biggest issue with housing affordability in our community is that we simply need, higher density and a streamlined regulatory process that makes, the townhome exemption more usable, that makes subdivisions come online faster than, 2 to 3 years, and really makes, investment in those projects happen at a quicker pace so that we can increase inventory and, meet some of the market demand.
Your thoughts on that, Mayor?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with Mr. Hertz on most of that. I will tell you that land availability and cost of land is a huge factor. And I'll tell you that I think if Dave Edgell were on this panel, he would tell you that the prices of his homes at Scott Street Village would be nothing like they were in terms of market rate, but for that assistance from TIF.
All right, I got a question here from Jane Van Boston. Can the mayor explain why Missoula deviates from typical government accounting, specifically the TIF money that is not treated as special revenue as it is in Billings or other Montana cities? Missoula accounts for the money under a component unity MRA. It includes transparency for citizens. City council oversight becomes minimal and is effectively a rubber stamp. That seems to be what we've been talking a lot about today, like transparency, accountability. How would you answer that question?
Sure. So I think we do use standard government accounting. It may not be the same as is used in other jurisdictions. Every expense and every receipt is available on our website all day long. It's dense. It's not particularly interesting. Pippa might be interested, but the general public isn't going to be interested in that level of detail. But all of that level of detail is available. With regard to accountability, I think there are a number of ways to slice this. Statute allows for the governing body to create a board to oversee TIF revenues and expenditures. That structure was set into place long before I showed up in the mayor's office. I appoint that board. I appoint people who I think challenge both the staff. I think they challenge projects, and they have certainly challenged me on more than one occasion with regard to the expenditure of TIF revenue. I have no problem with additional accountability, and I have no problem with folks who are elected to do a job making those decisions. What we have is a hybrid system. Fundamentally, large projects are a product of public scrutiny and decisions made by that elected governing body in the form of the city council. But those are reforms that I don't have any objection to considering.
Adam, do you want to comment?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yes, okay. She was asking for the mayor to explain why Missoula deviates from typical government accounting, specifically TIF money not treated as special revenue as it is in Billings. Missoula accounts for the money under a component unity MRA, which includes transparency for citizens. City council oversight becomes minimal and is effectively a rubber stamp. It sounds a little bit like some of your criticisms that you'd had earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to how the accounting is done, but certainly would like to see reform in oversight. Kind of somewhat related, but going back to the percentage of tax base that's tied up in TIF in Missoula. When I was in the legislature in 2017, and this was a hot button topic in tax committee, Missoula was at about 4%. As the mayor noted, I think we're near 14% now. And at that point in time, people were criticizing me, saying, "Well, it's only 4%. It's not a big deal." Well, look how far we've come in 3 years. We've gone from 4% to 14%. So we've got exponential growth, and while certainly some of that may have been created because of TIF districts, I think much of it was simply captured. And I think that's something we need to look at closely. Right now, it's my understanding the most recent budget cycle, $13 million was in MRA's budget, although they spent $30 million because much of it was bonded. So they spent 13, but had bond proceeds. You compare that to the total tax revenue received by the city, which is about $40 million a year. The city also has fee income and other things, and keep in mind your property tax bill is not just from the city of Missoula; it's from the state and from the county and other taxing jurisdictions. But I think we're at a tipping point here where we really need to pay attention to how much of our base is going to get captured in TIF, and are we going to starve these other taxing jurisdictions? When the city did their tax remittance in 2018, when the school district and county were asked, how are you going to use the remittance proceeds, they said, well, we're not going to have to raise taxes as much. So I think they really proved the point that if this isn't watched efficiently, it can create tax increases.
Question from Hermina Harold wants to know, does Montana's statute allow redevelopment agencies to condition the use of TIF funding so that the businesses that get the subsidy have to ensure living wages and are paid to the workers at those businesses?
Yeah, so we use development agreements pretty relentlessly with private entities who are making application for TIF. And typically that living wage is really a function of either federal or little Davis-Bacon rules in terms of wages paid. But yes, we condition those that allocation of funds really regularly.
But if they didn't do it, even when they said they would, is there any sort of
we get money back.
Write us a check, man. Okay, another question. There have been numerous competitive infrastructure grants available where MRA has participated grant funding procurement. Can you expand on the benefits and magnitude of grant funding that has been secured due to the availability of TIF funding leverage to support grant applications and provide the infrastructure match? Did I read that in a way that made any sense at all?
It did, yeah. So Jill, so if we look at any of those affordable housing projects that I mentioned earlier, what you'll see is a combination of resources. So we're really good in Missoula at cobbling things together, particularly around affordable housing. So almost all of those projects are going to have federal funds, either through community development block grant or home funds or other sources. And our ability to demonstrate that that the community is supporting this through TIF makes a huge difference in making those projects work.
Okay, this one's did you want to comment on that, Adam? I have another question. Okay, this one's from Connie Kehoe for the mayor and actually both of you. What reforms for TIF proposed by Adam would you support during the 2021 legislative session, from what you've heard him talking about?
So over the course of about the last 3 years, the Montana League of Cities and Towns, which is basically our trade association, led by Tim Burton and Kelly Lynch, worked with municipal staff around the state and with the legislature in trying to do some education around TIF. Because there is considerable misinformation and misunderstanding, and I think that there are opportunities to reform. So I don't have a problem with a cap, for example, on percentage of general fund. But I think we need to understand what that is and what it actually gets us, right? When we begin to limit the flexibility of TIF, we also begin to limit our ability to assist with really good projects that matter to this community and that are expressed in lots of policy documents. You know, the notion that we need to limit length of district, we've actually done that. The legislature has done that. The challenge with the legislature is there's another side to this coin. That is, if resources aren't available to local government to do infrastructure work, et cetera, then general fund taxes are absolutely going to go up. One of the things that tends to happen in Helena is that folks there get to take a lot of credit for either holding the line on taxes or attempting to reduce taxes or limit local government control, but they never have any responsibility on the other side of that, and that is what doesn't get done. What doesn't get done in a jurisdiction where an enormous percentage of the municipal budget goes to police and fire, when the jurisdiction's ability to tax is limited at half the rate of inflation. That is a legislative imposition on local government to try to manage resources. And so if we're going to take something away from TIF, understand that there will be consequences, and those consequences aren't necessarily what the folks who I swore to serve are interested in having occur in their communities.
So Adam, if you could bullet point the things that you would like to see changed or rewritten when it comes to the TIF funding, so we kind of have a clearer vision of what you think might work better.
Yeah, I think capping the percentage of the city's tax base that can be tied up in increment is the most important, because I think it just creates broad requirement to use these dollars efficiently and really make projects competitive with each other, and not have the temptation to capture increment, but rather work to create more increment. I don't know what percentage is appropriate. I did carry a Tif study bill through the legislature. Unfortunately, it got assigned to the wrong interim committee. There wasn't a lot of interest in it. I was not on that interim committee, and nothing really became of it. But I think it's important to study that and determine, where that appropriate cutoff is, because it does take increment away from these other taxing jurisdictions. So while the mayor's right that perhaps the city would be forced to raise taxes, although I don't think the city would, I think they could more efficiently use these dollars. It's already forcing other jurisdictions to raise taxes. So I think that's the most important one. I think number two is redefining blight. Right now, the definition of blight in state code is frankly bizarre. I mean, one of the indicators of blight is that there's excess land coverage, density. But we're using TIF to create higher density. So that doesn't make any sense to me. The way that we've defined blight in state law, it was done decades ago, and I think that certainly needs to be rewritten. I think those are two of the most important ones, although, the third one of transparency is probably equally as important, which is to say that either the governing body needs to oversee these decisions, or elected officials in some capacity, because I just don't think there's enough accountability if a private company or if an appointed board is overseeing millions of dollars in spending decisions with local taxpayer dollars.
So transparency and accountability are very different things, and I think it's important that we don't conflate them. I'll also note that we don't need the legislature to make some of these decisions with regard to how we deploy TIF. So for the last year, I've been having discussions with council members and staff about the potential for capping TIF revenues, which we can do as a function of policy and municipal ordinance.
I did have someone ask Mayor, if you could expand a bit more on who appoints MRA board members. So maybe people.
It's all me, as it turns out. So there are 5 members appointed to that board, and those appointments are at my discretion, subject to confirmation by the city council. And over the years, I've looked for different attributes. In some cases, I want a combination of gray hair and millennials. I want gender equity. I want, again, people who are independent of thought. I can tell you that there are really smart people on that board who, as I say, aren't afraid to challenge staff or me or folks who are seeking TIF funds.
Got a question from Alani, who wants to know, can a privately owned mobile home park or on county land apply for TIF money?
It would have to be in a TIF district, and it would depend on what the application was for.
So for both Adam and John, is there anything you heard from the other that maybe you're going to take to heart or think is a good point or could work with between the two of you guys debate?
Yeah, so I always, and I think this is less debate and more discussion, and I always think that we can get better no matter what we do. And I really appreciate the fact that Adam recognizes the value of TIF and that he's interested in reform rather than abolition, because in his line of work, I think he can certainly recognize that there are opportunities for the public and the private sectors to work together to do good things for the community. And I think TIF is the place where most of those public-private partnerships can exist, because we just don't have that many options. We're happy to consider reform. We're happy to consider alternatives. But I tell you, as we look at the next few years, we have lots of opportunity to deploy those TIF resources. One of the projects that we'll be bringing to the Missoula Redevelopment Agency Board this month will be really a long overdue locker and shower facility for our police department at the Catlin building, which was also acquired through TIF. That will allow these officers who today they take home everything that happens to them at work on their clothes to their home. And in the age of COVID, that's just not acceptable. So we'll be deploying some of that money to get that done. And there are lots of those opportunities that are ahead of us.
Adam, anything the mayor said that you agree with or might want to ponder?
Certainly appreciate the mayor's willingness to engage, and always appreciate the discussion. And you know, hearing things like there's been local discussions of potentially capping the increment is great to hear. I think those decisions are important to make locally because, you know, I think resistance to reasonable reform might result in the knee-jerk reaction of the legislature just eliminating this tool altogether. While, you know, every city does things different, as I previously mentioned, Whitefish had 30% of their increment. I think there are sideboards that need to be created by the legislature just to ensure that, you know, abuse isn't running rampant. But the more that local government can look to be efficient and accountable, the better. And I appreciate that the mayor has an eye towards doing that.
Unmute myself. We have a couple of minutes. If you maybe wanted to do a 2-minute summary on your thoughts on TIF as we conclude here, I can start with the mayor. Probably all topped out by now.
Yeah, well, yeah, that actually has been known to happen. It's rare, though. Well, first, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and talk about it reasonably. And one thing about Adam is that we've always been able to have reasonable conversations. And again, we can always get better. I do think that I do think that there's a lot of noise around TIF, and it's not nearly as black and white as folks suggest. And when we throw around terms like corporate welfare and more, I think it's really important to look underneath the rhetoric and understand the detail of what investment has actually been made and what the impact of those investments are. And I think as each of these TIF districts settles over time, sunsets is the term of art that we use, we will see a tremendous boon to the tax base. We will see infrastructure that's in place that might have long languished or never have gotten completed, all of which adds to the quality of life in the community, the value of the community, property values, and again, back to that notion of tax base. So this is a tool that we use to redevelop and enhance our community, and I believe that it comes at a reasonable cost to the tax base and the other taxing jurisdictions who also take advantage and benefit over the long term from that investment. And I would very much hate to see the tool go away because it's worked here very well and it's worked elsewhere very well.
Thanks, Mayor. Adam, some final thoughts?
I think it's really important that with any tax incentive that we be careful that it doesn't become a race to the bottom. We've seen a lot of that with Amazon across the country, that local governments are just bending over backwards to get Amazon in, creating, you know, massive tax abatement and all kinds of other handouts that I think at some point in time, you know, you have to ask the question, is it actually worth it? And so I think it's really important that we have an eye towards reforming TIF districts and to ensure that it's not a race to the bottom with other, you know, taxing jurisdictions or communities across the state or in other states, that we're allowing organic growth to happen and using TIF as a incentive in places where it otherwise would not happen. It's important that with any tool like this, that, you know, we don't let it devolve into you know, crony capitalism or major social engineering. There's issues with urban planning fads or promoting riskier development, and we just really need to be careful with incentives, that they're truly incentives, that they're not handouts, that they're achieving the goals that are set forth. And I think there's just some minor reforms that could take place both locally and at the state level in order to ensure that happens.
So Adam, you're going to run for mayor one of these days?
I moved out of the city limits.
Oh, there you go.
That shouldn't stop you, Adam.
All right, Susan, I think you're mute, but I think got a couple minutes left and you wanted to wrap this up with us.
First, I want to thank you all. Jill, thank you so much again for moderating. To our three panelists for an excellent, informative, and civil discussion of a complex and controversial issue in our community. Thank you to our audience for their great questions, and again to our sponsors for sticking with us, making it possible for us to bring these forums to you. Please join us. Please join us by sponsoring at cityclubmissoula.com. Please join us again on July 13 for a forum on mental health issues. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the forefront gaps in our mental health care system and opportunities where change can and must be made if we're going to avoid a tsunami of mental health issues, including suicide, which we know has long been an issue in our community. We're assembling a panel of expert local people to talk about the effects of COVID-19 on people struggling with mental health issues and about what's needed in response. So we hope you will join us again, likely via Zoom on July 13. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your active civic participation. And again, thanks to all of our panelists.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.